Hey everyone, we're going to talk about the last mob war of New York City. And I bet you it's a war that most of you have never heard of. And this war involves the Bonanno family. It's actually between two factions. You have the Mikey Knows Mancuso faction, and you also have the Joe C. Cammarano faction of the Bonanno family. And so we're going to visit the everything that's went on in this what I call a bloodless war. I don't know if you could actually call it bloodless because there were beatings, even though no one was killed in this war. There were beatings and um, embarrassments, and law enforcement, and rats, and all that. So it's kind of a interesting story. So my name's James Proctor. I'm the host of Real Mob Stories, and without further delay, on to our feature presentation. And so the heart of the dispute was who would control the family's future? Would it be Mancuso or Josie? And so Mancuso, though he was in prison at the time, sent the word that Badalamenti was to, quote, take the bull by the horns and basically keep the family in line until Mancuso was out. But Josie, feeling empowered as acting boss on the street, quietly tried to solidify his own position. So the feud escalated in 2017. Mancuso was still in prison, but Joe C. allegedly made a move to anoint himself the official boss. He started trying to get support from the other captains, and he wanted them to recognize him as the permanent boss instead of a placeholder. But the word got back to Mancuso in prison, and he wasn't happy at all. And so the stage was set for a collision once Mancuso returned to the streets. So Mancuso gets released in early 2019, and he acted swiftly. And as noted, he shelved Joe C. and the entire faction at the same time. And that included Zancocchio and even Vito Grimaldi, who was Joe C.'s father in law and a key ally and known for, owning a bakery. They were all expelled from the family ranks in 2019. What upset Mancuso was the fact that the defense portrayed the Bonannos as having a carousel of different leaders between 2012 and 2018, and it implied that Mancuso lacked a steady hand in leadership. And so he decided Joe C had to go, and basically his whole group, they were traitors. They were grabbing for power, and it embarrassed the family in his eyes. So Camarano is off the street, and he pretty much accepted his ostracism in silence. He was in an internal exile. You didn't really hear much about him, but all hell broke loose in July of 2022. In fact, is in one of the most unlikely venues imaginable. It was at a wake at a suburban funeral home. So Vito Grimaldi, who's Josie's father-in-law, and also the shelf captain we was talking about, passed away at the age of 75, and the wake was held at the Dodge Thompson Funeral Home in Glen Cove, Long Island. And despite being a persona non grata with Mancuso, Joe C. chose to attend the wake. And why wouldn't he? He's paying respect to his wife's father. But Mancuso was pissed off about it. So he was going to send a group of guys to give Josie a beating there at the wake. Just crazy. And so he brought a guy, Johnny Mulberry, one of the capos, Johnny Mulberry. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. Also, Ernie Aiello, and then the guy John Spirito. That's the same guy that had been shelved earlier for lying. Apparently, he got back in good graces with Mancuso, and so they were told that don't allow Camarano in the funeral parlor, and they were told to rough him up if he tried to enter. But what happened next was like a scene out of a dark comedy. And I mean, it was really embarrassing. So as Joe C. approached the casket to pay the respects, the trio of Bonanno wise guys jumped him in full view of the mourning family members. And Camarano, who was actually a Navy vet and a motorcycle enthusiast, wasn't alone. So he had a number of biker gang members that were in the audience, and they immediately rushed to Josie's defense. And all of a sudden, you had a melee between the mobsters and the bikers inside the funeral home. and the bikers just trumps Mancuso's hit squad, basically wiped the floor with the Bonannos, and this left the would-be attackers beaten and bloodied on the floor. So, in a twist worthy of Hollywood, the men sent to deliver a punishment end up being sent to the hospital themselves. Another guy compared it to the famous scene in A Bronx Tale where the guys beat up the biker interlopers, except this was the opposite of that. And the bikers routed the mobsters. And so the so-called Bonanno family home brawl was definitely a public embarrassment for the family. And the news of the altercation quickly reached law enforcement. And the FBI actually reportedly launched an investigation there in Nassau County to see if there's any legal, if there was anything they could do. And also, they were looking at potential illegal retaliation related to the feud. And for Mancuso, the optics were just terrible. His enemy showed him up in what was supposed to be his own turf. So a mob associate told reporters afterward, now that this got out, something has to be done. Somebody has to save face. And the thought was that Mancuso would feel compelled to answer the humiliation. And indeed, in the months following, there were whispers of further retaliations ordered by Mancuso. A couple of months later, unknown assailants beat up a man named Vincent Restivo. He was the son of a late Bonanno wise guy who was friendly with Joe C's camp. And they even smashed a champagne bottle over his head, requiring 60 stitches. Unknown, or I guess underworld sources believe this attack was also orchestrated by Mancuso's people as part of settling scores with the funeral debacle. And in essence, nobody associated with Joe C felt safe. But since this one attack in 2022, there hasn't been any further escalation that we know of, and Joe C and his folks are just staying under the radar. Now we're going to talk about Peter Lavaglio, who I call the rogue captain. So he was a Bronx-born mobster, and he got inducted into the Bonanno family around 1999, and he was a protege of the Cammarano crew. And he ends up going to prison in the early 2010s for stock fraud. And at that time, he was a rising star. So when he gets released from prison in 2012, he gets moved up to captain. And by 2015, he was running a crew that included soldiers and associates across New York and also in Florida. But his success was undermined by a lack of control. He was impulsive and he just had a combustible, you know, attitude. So we go to November 1st, 2015, and Pia Lavaglio erupted in violence at a place called Takayama Sushi Lounge. It was a trendy restaurant in Staten's South Shore. And according to police and witnesses, Lavaglio was drunk and he got into an argument with the owner of the lounge. And a confrontation broke out and it turned physical. And Lavaglio ended up smashing a drinking glass into the owner's face with such force that it shattered, slashing the man's face and permanently blinding him in one eye. This was a brutal and just reckless, classless attack by a drunken mob capo. And this was done in a public venue that people could see. So Lavaglio fled the scene. He goes into hiding for nearly 2 weeks before surrendering to authorities. And it made headlines all over the New York newspapers. And it was portraying the Bonanno family in a very negative light. He had violated a core mafia tenet: do not attract unnecessary attention. And worse, by injuring an innocent civilian, he risked galvanizing law enforcement on all Bonanno operations in Staten Island. And at the time of the assault, Lavaglio had only been out of prison for about 8 months. And it's clear he hadn't adjusted life on the outside or as a responsible captain. And rumors circulated that he had a serious alcohol issue. He had hit the bottle that evening, one account dryly noted, and Camarano Josie had to take action. In addition to the Takayama Lounge fiasco, Lavaglio had entangled the family in another predicament because he owed $18,000 to a Gambino family loan shark, Billy Scotto, and he wasn't paying it back. And this put the Bonannos in danger of beefing with the Gambinos over a delinquent debt. And all told, Lavaglio was just a major liability. So in early 2016, Joe C. formally shelved Lavaglio. Captains Joseph Sabella and Porky Zancocchio delivered the bad news to Lavaglio. He was out. They stripped him of his crew and relieved him of all duties. And, for a mafioso, being shelved's a great punishment. It means you remain alive and technically a member, but you have no standing, no income from the family, and you can't engage with anyone in the family, not even with another family. So basically, an internal exile. At the time, he was 54 years old. He had a violent felony assault charge pending in state court, now ostracized by his own crime family. So guess what? Lavaglio chooses to flip. In June 2016, he approached the FBI and became a confidential informant. Perhaps he hoped for leniency on his assault case. Perhaps it was vengeance against those in the family who put him aside. So the next month, July 2016, Lavaglio arranged a meeting with acting boss Joe C. there at Joe C's Long Island home. He wanted to appeal his sentence of being shelled by the family. He spoke with him for about 30 minutes. He discussed the family's recent disorder, Lavaglio's missteps, but all the while Lavaglio was secretly recording the conversation for the feds. They said during this chat, Cammarano candidly talked about the need to, restructure entire family after an earlier acting boss's poor performance, and about how the Bonannos had, been in the fucking gutter for the last 12 to 18 years. And he also scolded Lavaglio for running roughshod over everyone and not keeping his affairs in order. And these tape statements would later surface in court, embarrass the family by highlighting its dysfunction and providing prosecutors with an insider's perspective to the affairs of the Bonanno family. So ultimately, Lavaglio pled guilty in 2017 to first degree assault for the Susie Lounge attack. He received a state prison sentence, believe 8 years, but by then he was fully, an informant, a rat, and he later took the stand as a government witness in 2019 in the federal racketeering case against, guess who? Joe C. and Zancocchio. That was the case they actually beat. And also Thomas Carube, he testified in that case against them. But like I said, there was a lot of the Bonanno's dirty laundry that was put out in the open in that trial. And then I want to talk about the shocking murder of Sally Zottola. A lot of people thought that was a gangland rub out. This was in 2018, but this is just a real disturbing family betrayal is with his son. So Sylvester Zottola was a 71-year-old Bronx-based associate. He operated a bunch of those illegal joker poker machines, and he was a loan shark. He wasn't a made man, but he was close friends with people like Vinny Basciano back in the day, and he had earned millions of dollars from his gambling business, and then he used that money to have a legitimate real estate portfolio. So I mean, the guy was a multi-millionaire, and he was considered a reliable moneymaker. He had always paid tribute to the mob for operating on their turf and never was a problem. He was well liked. So, an associate in good standing, it became a surprise in early 2017 that Sally Daz had survived 6 assassination attempts in the span of a year. Finally, on October 4th, 2018, the assassins got their man. Zottola was ambushed and shot to death at a McDonald's drive-thru in the Bronx while waiting for a cup of coffee. Surprise! And then the biggest surprise was that the mastermind behind the murder was Zottola's own son, Anthony. Anthony's motive was that he wanted his father's businesses and assets, and he didn't want to share it with his brother Salvatore. Most people at the time thought it was some sort of gangland slaying. Everyone would think that. You have a so-called mob guy gets shot and in broad daylight, and so people thought it was a hit, but it was his son Anthony. Just a sad situation. And what had happened was Anthony had reached out to the Bloods gang, and there was a guy named Bouchon Shelton that he was working directly with, and they were behind all of the attempts on his life, and finally they succeeded in it. This guy Anthony wasn't that smart because he put incriminating evidence in his phones. He was sending text messages back and forth, talking about the botched earlier tries. And so in October 2022, Anthony gets convicted of the murder of his father and also the attempted murder of his brother. And so he got life in prison without parole. And so, you had several others that also got time. The hitman, his name was Hyman Ross. He got life behind bars. And then the guy Bouchon Shelton, kind of the middleman who arranged everything, he pled guilty in June of 2023 and got 37 years in prison. Even though it wasn't a gangland slaying, it was still something that brought attention and affected the broader Bonanno family. So we'll continue on, and now we move up to December of 2024. And you've had years of chaos, years of decline with the Bonanno family, and you've got new people coming in and people coming out. And so we recently got headlines about this guy, Peter Pasta Pellegrino. So he's a Bonanno wise guy. And, this guy's had a career with a bunch of ups and downs. And he was actually shelved at one time. He was on reality TV. He was part of that. What was it? It was the Kitchen Nightmares with Gordon Ramsay. So he was part of that. And so he got his name because he owned a restaurant called Peter's Italian Restaurant there in Babylon on Long Island. But when you look at the episode of Kitchen Nightmares, Pellegrino was just embarrassing. He was arguing with Ramsay. He was doing a lot of dramatic posturing with his hands. He was brash, and the guy, really came across as a jerk off. He wore flashy suits, had the nice cars, and thought of himself as a local celebrity. But at the time of and when this was done, I think it was like 2007. He was actually a Bonanno associate, and so the appearances on television, all of the flashiness and all that didn't go well with the old timers within the Bonanno family. And at the time, you had Nicky Cigar's Santora. He was his captain, and Santora actually shelved Peter Pasta. And they said something about that Peter had words about something with Nikki at a wedding, and anyway, he just acted a fool at the wedding, so they shelved him. But the thing was, Pellegrino was able to worm his way back into the family because he was close to Mancuso. And what we're told is that around 2017, he got he's back into the family. And they said most people said he kind of laid low. He was focused on making money. He was mostly involved in loan shark and gambling rackets, but he was definitely a money maker. And the thing is, especially in this day where you don't have many money makers, it's just harder than ever to make a buck in the underworld. Anyone that can bring money, to the Borgata, they're going to have a chance to move up. So he actually got promoted to acting captain. And then in December of 2024, we're told that allegedly he was made a full captain. And what's interesting about Pellegrino, besides having the crew there in Ridgewood, Queens, he also has a crew down in South Florida. And they're saying that in the Queens, he's forming an alliance with some Albanian gangsters, I guess to help out. And so Peter Pasta, made his move, and we'll see what happens. Maybe he's grown up since his time there on Kitchen Nightmares. And the other interesting news that came out of this so-called reorganization was that Mancuso brought back Anthony, Bruno, and Delicato as his consigliere, and that's a name that goes way back. Bruno's father was Sonny Red, and Sonny Red was killed by Messino, and Bruno Indelicato was involved in the 1979 Carmine Galante hit. He spent a lot of time in prison. When he was younger, he was really I guess you'd call him, he was just a really wild. He was just out of control, to be honest. He had a lot of drug problems. He just liked to party, and so he's not someone you would think that would be a consigliere, someone that has to be able to think and make decisions, you know, in more intelligent fashion. But uh, the thing that we knew about Bruno back in the day was that he had a bad temper. He's not someone you would think that would be any sort of consigliere. But again, people can change. He's been through a lot in prison. He's older now, so we'll see what happens. And that actually brings a name that has notoriety within the families. And he has his own crew. Apparently, he's actually pretty much, he's almost like a street boss as well, because he still has multiple crews that he's running while being consigliere, if we're to believe all the stories. I don't have the proof that all of this is true, but that's what the word is, by some of these guys that follow the mob. Anyway, thanks for watching, and please hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so, because we have much more stories like this coming up. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.